Hey, class, welcome back. Today we are still talking about the 1900s and 1920s, and we're talking about women's suffrage. What is women's suffrage? Women's suffrage was the right to vote. Women didn't always have the right to vote. It wasn't until around 1920 that they got the right to vote. All right. So you had all these years that they couldn't vote. Men could vote. Women couldn't vote. And so that's what we're talking about today. Women's suffrage. They went through a whole lot to get to the right to vote. So women's suffrage is a right of women to vote and to hold an elected office. That's what women's suffrage is.
What is women's suffrage? Women's suffrage is the right of women to vote and hold an elected office.
So when did women get the right to vote? You may think, like I said, that women always had the right to vote, but this isn't true. All right, they didn't. It was up until the 1900s. Most democracies throughout history only allowed men to vote. So this includes democracies of ancient Greece, the Roman Republic, early democracies in Britain and the United States. Women didn't have the right to vote, only men.
When did women get the right to vote? You may think that women have always had the right to vote. This is far from the truth. Up until the 1900s, most democracies throughout the history only allowed men to vote. This includes democracies of ancient Greece, the Roman Republic, and early democracies in Britain and the United States.
So the right to vote continued here. In the United States, women were not allowed to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment. And this was in 1920. This was 100 years ago, a little over 100 years, 101 years ago. So in some countries, the date was much later, such as in Kuwait, where women weren't given the right to vote until 2005. In other countries, the date was earlier. New Zealand, it pioneered women's suffrage in 1893. But overall, it hadn't been but over 100 years, a little over 100 years, that women's had the right to vote in most countries.
The right to vote. In the United States, women were not allowed to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 19. That's a little over 100 years ago. In some countries, the date was much later, such as in Kuwait, where women weren't given the right to vote until 2005. In other countries, the date was earlier, as in New Zealand, when pioneered women's suffrage in 1893.
So the history of women's suffrage in the United States, gaining equal rights for women was a long and slow process. And that's what I said at the very beginning. It took a long time. They had to go through a whole lot of things. The first real fight for women's suffrage came out of the anti-slavery movement by the abolitionists in the 1840s and the 50s. People felt that not only should slavery come to an end, but that all people should be treated equal regardless of their race or their gender.
History of women's suffrage in the United States. Gaining equal rights for women, including the right to vote in the United States, was a long and slow process. The first real fight for women's suffrage came out of the anti-slavery movement by the abolitionists in the 1840s and 50s. These people felt that not only should slavery come to an end, but that all people should be treated equal regardless of race or gender.
All right, the Seneca Falls Convention. This was in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. The first women's right convention was held there, Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Around 300 people attended the meeting. It was led by Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which were big women's right movement advocates. All right. The main outcome of the meeting was the Declaration of Sentiments. It was a document similar to the Declaration of Independence, and it stated, hey, women should have equal rights to men, including the right to vote. So they wanted equal rights for women. Like I said, women did not always have equal rights that they do nowadays, right? And they were fighting hard to try to get equal rights for them.
Seneca Falls Convention. The first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Around 300 people attended the meeting, which was led by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The main outcome of the meeting was the Declaration of Sentiments, a document similar to the Declaration of Independence. It stated that women should have equal rights to men, including the right to vote.
All right. So then you came up with the NWSA, all right, the National Women's Suffrage Association. All right. You had Susan B. Anthony up here. All right. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I told you they were big women's rights advocates. All right. The main goal of this group was to get an amendment passed that would allow women to vote. All right. They wanted the 15th Amendment to include the right for women to vote as well as people of any race. But the 15th Amendment, when it passed in 1870, it allowed all men to vote regardless of race, but not women.
National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1869, women leaders Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. The main goal of this group was to get an amendment passed that would allow women to vote. They wanted the 15th Amendment to include the right for women to vote as well as people of any race. However, the 15th Amendment passed in 1870, allowing all men regardless of race to vote, but not women.
All right, so gaining the right to vote in states. Women didn't have the right to vote for federal government. They began to make progress in certain states, certain territories that hadn't become states yet. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory, all right, granted the right to vote to women. And later in 1890, Wyoming only agreed to join the Union as a state if women would be allowed to vote. So Wyoming was one of these states, and Wyoming right here in red. It said, in 1869, it granted the right to vote women in their state. All right. And they said, hey, we're only going to join the Union in 1890 if women will be allowed to vote.
Gaining the right to vote in states. Although women did not have the right to vote for federal government, they began to make progress in certain states and territories. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory granted the right to vote to women. Later, in 1890, Wyoming only agreed to join the Union as a state if women would be allowed to vote.
All right. In 1893, Colorado became the first state to adopt an amendment that granted women voting rights. So Colorado was the first state that adopted an amendment. All right. Soon other Western states followed, including Utah, Idaho in 1896, and Washington State in 1910, just 10 years before the right to vote passed. More and more states began to make amendments to the Constitution, and momentum for the passage of the 19th Amendment grew in the early 1900s. So it started getting momentum. People started getting excited about it. Hey, we're going to do this. All these states are joining in. We're going to get this not only statewide, but we're going to get it nationally. We're going to get it federal.
Gaining rights continued. In 1893, Colorado became the first state to adopt an amendment that granted women voting rights. Soon, other Western states followed, including Utah and Idaho in 1896 and Washington State in 1910. More and more states began to make amendments to their Constitution, and momentum for the passage of the 19th Amendment grew in the early 1900s.
All right, the 19th Amendment. In 1917, the National Women's Party was formed to help fight women's rights. All right. You had Alice Paul, who we'll talk about just a little bit in just a moment. All right. You had Lucy Burns, organized protests in Washington. At this time, President Woodrow Wilson, this man right here, he was against the 19th Amendment. He was against women voting at the time. So Alice Paul, she was arrested and sent to jail where she held a hunger strike. All right. She held a hunger strike. And this was protest for women's rights. In 1918, President Wilson, he changed his mind just a year later, and he decided, hey, I'm going to support the amendment. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was signed into law, and it gave women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment of the Constitution gave women the right to vote. It's something they fought hard for. There's Alice Paul going to jail.
The 19th Amendment. In 1970, the National Women's Party was formed to help fight for women's rights. Leaders such as Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized protests in Washington. At the time, President Woodrow Wilson was against the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul was arrested and sent to jail where she held a hunger strike. In 1918, President Wilson changed his mind and decided to support the amendment, and on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was signed into law.
All right, we got our comprehension questions here. Number one, what was women's suffrage? And I've talked about this the whole time. Was it A, the right to go to jail, B, the right to vote, or C, women suffering? It was B. Women's suffrage is the right to vote and hold an elected office for women.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 2, where was the first women's rights convention held? All right. Where was it held? The first women's rights convention was A, Seneca Falls, New York, B, North Carolina, or C, Colorado. It was in A, Seneca Falls, New York.
Ding, ding, ding.
In
We have a winner.
1848. Number 3, what U.S. territory, which later became a state, were women first given the right to vote? Was it A, Colorado, B, North Carolina, or C, Wyoming? It was C. Wyoming was the first territory and later became a state in 1890. They joined the Union, and women were first given the right to vote there in Wyoming.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, what amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed women the right to vote? Which amendment? What amendment was it? Was it A, the First Amendment, B, the Fifth Amendment, or C, the 19th Amendment? It was C, the 19th Amendment was the one that guaranteed women the right to vote.
Ding, ding, ding.
Up until that point, they did not have the right to vote. Number 5, what women's right leader held a hunger strike in jail? Was it A, Susan B. Anthony, B, Alice Powell, or C, Elizabeth Stanton? It was B, Alice Powell. She went to jail, all right, for protesting women's rights. And then while she's in jail, she held a hunger strike while she was in jail, and they force fed her. All right, because she was doing a hunger strike and she was protesting against or protesting for women's rights, for the right to vote.
Ding, ding, ding.
And the last one, who was president when women gained the right to vote? He was against it at first. And just a year later, he changed his mind and he started supporting it. And it was that just 2 years later that it was passed. A, Abraham Lincoln, B, Teddy Roosevelt, or C, Woodrow Wilson. It was C, Woodrow Wilson. He was against it at first and then changed his mind, and they passed it in 1920.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, class, that is all for women's suffrage. We're going to get on into prohibition and some of the 1920s stuff on our next go around, and then we're going to come back to World War I. I'm not going to do World War I right this second. We'll come back to it because it's a whole separate unit by itself. So, but anyway, I will see you all next time. You all have a very good day.